Welcome back to the Metric Stack podcast. I am thrilled today to be joined by Ramli John. Ramli is the #1 Amazon best-selling author of Product-Led Onboarding. He's also director of content at Appcues. Ramli is also a creator, producer, and host of Growth Marketing Today, a weekly marketing podcast, and a product-led growth coach with Product-Led, the Institute for Leading Communities through the PLG process. My name is Alan Villa, co-founder and CEO at Klipfolio. Lauren Thibodeau, my trusty co-host, is on vacation this week, so we're flying solo. Ramli, so glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Alan. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. So today we're talking about activation or user activation rate. So Ramli, maybe before we get into some of the nitty gritty, maybe you can sort of set the stage. What kind of business objectives should we be thinking about as we dive into this metric?
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I would say it's probably one of the most important metrics in the pirate metrics. I mean, it really does, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but it impacts retention, it impacts referral, it impacts revenue, but it sets the stage for the first impression that people have for a product. And we all know first impressions really matter. First impression with your boss, first impression with your spouse, your partner, and like activation is such a critical metric for that first impression with your product.
So how would you define it? Because I think activation is one of those nebulous metrics, right? So, you can count very easily how many leads, you got in the funnel. You can count exactly how many wins you have in the funnel, right? And it's similar across every company. But what does activation mean? How would you define it best for our audience?
Yeah, that's where the tricky part of this metric is what is that the term, what activation is really depends on how a company defines it within. But really, you want to tie that activation really needs to be tied back to a really critical user action within the product that shows that they've experienced value with the product. And I can give you a few examples. The classic ones is like with Uber, when you book that first car ride, or Airbnb. But it gets really harder with B2B products where, like, let's say like HubSpot or Salesforce, where you can do 1,000 things with it. And, you really have to define that within your team and trying to dig into the data and the numbers and talking to your customers. For us at Appcues, it is also at a similar issue where, like, what is activation for us? And, we've kind of, quote unquote, struggled with it, try to really figure this out. We define, and through user interviews and through the data, we found like there's this one key moment when people realize, during user interviews, like they get the aha moment, like we was like, I get it. The activation moment for us is when people actually start designing like a flow or an onboarding flow, whether that's, like a product tour or some kind of checklist within like their app themselves. So, people have to install this Chrome plugin. And when they start seeing how easy it is to actually design like a flow with it's like, I don't have to bother my engineering or design team with this. So that's how we define activation. And now that we know what activation is for us, like that moment when people start realizing and seeing the value of the product, is when we can really dig into the activation rate.
And once you have that defined, like once somebody gets to an activation aha moment, is it then possible, like, do you then have line of sight towards how many people are going to convert into paying customers? Like, do you have that sort of sense of security that previously, if you weren't defining activation, you just have this huge blob of users, you don't really know who's gonna convert. So as soon as you have activation, is it a more secure path to those people that convert, or is that not part of the journey?
That is definitely part of the journey. That is part of the, like, once people have done that moment, you're seeing more conversion, like a higher conversion rate with people who've done that, but as well as a higher retention rate as well. And an example I can think of is with Slack. For them, they've set the line for their activation. It's actually super interesting. It's when a team has sent, I believe, 500 or 500 messages or something like that, but it's definitely not one message.
Yeah.
And the reason why they've set it at that is, the Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, said in an interview with First Round that they found that 93% of their accounts actually stick around and become lifelong customers once they've reached that specific threshold. So it does, like I mentioned earlier, like this, getting more people to the activation moment increases their likelihood of becoming a paying customer, but not just a paying customer, a long-term paying customer.
Yeah, and I think for sure. I mean, I think that is what we all want to get to. We don't want to just have somebody convert and then churn. We want to have enduring, long-term, growing value out of these folks. And I think you're right. I think with your example, it's not just one message that they send. I mean, somebody may say, "Oh, that's cool" with Slack, but they haven't built the habit yet. They haven't fully activated. And I think with Slack, obviously, it requires a team as well. There's a certain sort of motion and momentum that is required to sort of have an account activate. Actually, that I just said an account activate. Do you think of users or do you think of accounts activating?
Such a good question. It really, I think for B2B, and people need to start thinking about it more of an account. I think especially if it's a multiplayer product where, it requires you working with other teams, just having one like for example for Appcues, and I'm sure it's similar at Klipfolio, where you have like this end user that's like a hyper power user, and you got some users who are there within the same account that is the one with the credit card.
For sure.
Yeah, so they don't come on, they don't activate as often, and that's okay because within the account they have this one main power user that's actually using it day to day versus the one.
Yeah. So, as I was saying to you earlier, and for everybody listening, we're reading through Ramli's book right now. And I think you can actually probably read through the book at least like once every 6 months or once a year, right? And sort of get new ideas and refine the process. But you're right. I mean, we think of it as a bit of a team sport. We have people that are consuming the data in Klipfolio. We have people that are building the dashboards and the metrics. We have, you're right, somebody that's maybe going to pay for the product, right? And they all come in and play a pretty vital role. But do you think that each individual is going to have a different activation path as well?
I would say that, to your point, probably not. I think the person who is there to just put in the credit card, they might not be the one to design the dashboards and the graphs and plugging in the data. So I think I would find more value, and this is where the whole product-led growth movement is. There's the whole the value really comes in with the end user, because the people are not going to plug in their data. They're not going to pay the credit card if somebody is not the one using it is not getting a ton of value. And we've seen the whole funnel flip upside down, where the end user is now the one who, we need to show them the value so that they can go and pitch it up to the decision makers to really be like, hey, we want this, we're using this over and over. And this is the same path that with Slack saw, where a lot of people sign up for it and then they pitch it up to the managers. Like, hey, we're getting a ton of value. Why don't we get our whole company on this?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, we love that go-to-market motion. We're huge fans of, PLG is the way it's baked into our DNA. So for us, working through the activation flow is just so incredibly important. So tell me a little bit about one of the earlier books that we read as well was obviously awesome, right? And it talks about making sure that you get your best fit cohort into the funnel. So that, I'm sure, impacts activation rate, immeasurably. So how do you think you have to think about getting the right people in, or even before they've started the product experience? Where does activation start in that whole journey?
That is, you hit the nail on the head there. I think often people think about activation. It's because of the way the part metric is structured. Acquisition, activation, referral, retention, revenue, and they think it's sequential. And the real problem is acquisition and activation and retention are so closely linked together that when it comes to activation, you really need to be thinking about what, to your point, like the positioning that April Dunford has talked about, and obviously awesome. As well as like the channels, like even channels that you go to. An example I can think of is one of the clients that I worked with in the past. You run a bunch of Facebook ads, and sure, we got a bunch of signups, but those signups they left right away. They're probably on the mobile phone or something like that. So that channel, particularly that strategy, that tactic, sure, we're getting a bunch of acquisition, we're acquiring, we're great at acquiring, but like they're not activating it, they're not coming back to become paying customers.
Oh, Ramli, you're like diving a knife into my chest. Like we have done that exact thing, and we were celebrating how many Facebook leads we were getting, right? And yeah, I mean, lots and lots of leads and signups, but they weren't the right fit. So I think the expectation that they had and how much time they actually spent, diving into the value was just not a fit for what we were looking for.
Totally. I think that's a really good point. Like the channel matters. And then I think also positioning is super critical because there's a whole emotional side to the front end. Like before people come into your product, if you can get them excited, like super excited, like it's like getting into a party and getting it hyped up before you get into the party. Of course, your expectation is going to be high, but you're like looking forward to it and you're more motivated to actually have fun and try out the product versus like a positioning that's very unclear. It's like, what is this saying? What are your product? They're more skeptical. And so they might turn off when they first hit friction or some kind of a roadblock versus somebody super motivated might actually go through. So I really do believe like, when people are looking at activation, people jump into like, let's fix the product, the in-app experience. Where like often the issue I see is more on the upper side of the funnel where their positioning isn't clear or and the messaging isn't super clear that the value of the product is not being shared very succinctly and clearly to the users before they even get it.
Yeah, the right market, the right user. We have to tell the users the right things before they even sign up for the trial or the freemium account. And then we have to do the right things in app. Now, what about the other side of the equation? What about once a customer signs up? Does activation play a role on that side as well? Or is activation really focused more on the pre and the early few days of the product experience? How far does it extend?
Yeah, I would say, once they're quote unquote, they've reached the activation moment, like you really, the teams who are working on this really need to continue showing value. And you said something earlier that really like struck, that's the whole gist of this, the end goal of all of this. You said habit forming. And sure, when you form, Alan, what's a recent habit that you form? Is it like writing or like waking up early? Like, is there any habit that you recently formed?
Ramli, you're putting me on the spot, but what is a recent habit that I have formed? Oh my God, one that I want to share publicly. So I don't know. Let's say I formed a habit. Every night I have a drink with dinner.
Yeah, right. Drinking water. I think the first time it's like, okay, this is all right, but like the habit doesn't form after 2 or 3 times. For me, it's writing, right? Like writing the first time is hard. And then you keep going at it, and then eventually it becomes a consistent pattern of your behavior, and you don't have to think about it anymore. It's like it just happens. I think that's really the end goal of all of this. Is like, how do we get our users to form a habit with a product?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I just this past weekend I watched the Social Dilemma. Right, this is the super scary Netflix movie for all parents. About how incredibly habit building the social networks have become. So if you want to know how to form habits, watch the Social Dilemma as well. They have got it nailed down.
I have seen that as well. It is it is there is a dark side to that habit forming stuff.
Yeah, there definitely is. But we're talking about making sure that the user who comes in has obviously raised their hand and they've said, there's something here that I need to do from a business point of view, right? We're talking B2B software. So we want to help them be successful. And, it's a waste of our time and it's a waste of their time if A, they're the wrong user, and if B, we're not communicating the value early on. We could have the best product in the world, but, at the end of the day, a massive amount of customers or users don't go on to day 2. So how do we communicate that properly? I think that's the kind of habit that we're really talking about here. So
yeah, I'm totally with you there. I think you're not just thinking about day 1, you're thinking about day 2 and day 30 particularly. think I've read some stats that, like within the first, most SaaS products lose their users within the first 2 to 3 days. And I think that's just making sure that, that first mile, as Scott Belsky, the chief product officer at Adobe said, like, you really got to nail that first mile, like that first few minutes or a few hours that you have with the user.
So does that mean that if we are talking about activation rate, that like should SaaS product companies and product teams and the marketing teams, is the biggest opportunity for those that have never really looked at activation, is the biggest opportunity in the first few days? Like if they were going to tackle, and what is the biggest lever to focus on? Should they be looking at activation over 7 days, 30 days, 90 days? Or is it really sort of a, figure out the first couple of minutes and figure out the first, couple of days? What is your advice there?
Yeah, I'm a little bit biased. The data that I've seen, and I'm sure your team has seen that as well, is like that first, let's get the first day correct first. Like that moment, the first time that they sign up. I think that we can never get that back. Like I said, the first impression is super, super critical. I think once that is really figured out, it's when you start looking at the future. Interestingly enough, some companies like I've talked to, like Deputy, I chatted with the head of growth there. They really try to button down, like within the first 7 minutes, a user needs to activate, or else we're gonna lose them forever. It's like, what? How did you get 7 minutes? Like, oh, we looked at the data, we talked to our customers. It's like, man, that's really, really specific, the way that they are super intentional about the way that their product customer success and growth team are really working together.
So Ramli, you may be onto something there, because a couple of years ago, I was in California and I visited with Intuit, the makers of QuickBooks. I was blown away because they actually have a team that focuses on the first 10 minutes. Like this, and QuickBooks is used by hundreds of millions of small, mid-sized businesses. Think about how many people that they're onboarding and looking to activate and show the value to. So a team focused on the first 10 minutes. Now, it probably varies tremendously from company to company. So, and again, like, I don't know that you can, because you can't specifically define activation for every company the same way. Maybe it's 10 minutes, maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 7 days. Like, I don't know how long it took Slack to get to 500 or 2,000 messages, but probably not within the first 5 minutes. So it probably does vary quite a bit.
Totally. And I think going back to that Slack example, I think their product team probably is similar. I really love that example. I need to talk to somebody from Intuit now. The first 10 minutes, they probably have a team dedicated to the first message and then the first 100 message. Yeah. And then Slack probably has one all the way to the 500 message. So I think it's more of a marathon where, like, okay, we got to get people to the first mile. After that, let's get them to the second mile. And then let's get them to the whole marathon, 26 miles or whatever that is.
Yeah. And I mean, I think everybody's seen those, decay curves. You get 1,000 people in, on a daily or monthly basis. And then you look at day 2 and my God, that is a scary cliff that, that shows you how many people never, ever come back, right? So again, I think there's a huge, huge lever, especially for companies that have never focused on early activation or onboarding. Like, focus on the first, I would say, couple of days minimally, and then sort of start learning, what else is happening. So I know the answer is no, but I want to hear it from you. Is there a benchmark for activation?
Yeah, you already there. It's really, really tough. I think you made the point. Like, activation can the activation event can be different for different companies, as well as like it could your team's definition of activation could change. Like, for example, at Appcues, we changed what an activation event is. First of all, before it was getting them to publish live on the site, and it's like we realized, well, that's way too far down the user journey, and we want to see more of a leading indicator. And we define it earlier now to, like, just installing a Chrome plugin and seeing it live. But I have seen in general, like, a good benchmark for activation rate is between like 20 to 40%, something like that for users. But don't quote me on that. I would compare it from week to week. Within your product, as well as like really trying to hone in on what activation event is.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, I think companies need to compare to how are they doing historically. All companies are, of course, different. Some products are much simpler for users to understand and see the value, and other products are much more complicated, or maybe it's more of a team approach before they can truly activate. But I think that's a good number to keep in mind. Aspire to be 20 to 40% if you can get there. And of that cohort, they should then be predictably converting into paid accounts. And I mean, that's a whole nother, kettle of fish. How do you put the right levers in place and pricing model? But certainly from an activation point of view, I like that as sort of a very rough benchmark. What are the other metrics that you typically look at or think about when you're looking at activation rate as well?
Yeah, in terms of activation rate, I think people can take a look at now, once they've activated, you want to take a look at your cohort of weekly active users or monthly active accounts. Could be something that people need to be looking at. I think as soon as the activation event isn't just for the first time onboarding experience, it's also a good way to see whether your users or accounts are healthy, and that could, which ones are churn risk. So I think those are some really important one. That activation event is super critical to not just activation rate for new users, but as well as for regular users and power users that could potentially show to you how well your accounts and your business is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as your activation rate goes up, as you just said, like keep an eye on daily, weekly, monthly active users. That should be going up as well. You should be retaining those and growing that cohort. And then clearly, this has got massive downstream, opportunities as well. So your conversion rate is going to go up. Your retention rate is going to go up because people get it. Hopefully your K factor or your virality will increase as well, because people will say, hey, wow, this product is so cool. And hopefully they will tell their other best fit friends about it as well. So you sort of get that multiplier effect as well. So Ramli, any last advice? So, for somebody that is just starting to think about activation, they've got a software application, they've got users coming in, maybe they haven't even looked at, that green thread journey. Any advice that you would give somebody who's just starting to think about activation rate?
Yeah, you brought up the book, Obviously Awesome. I would also suggest people take a look at that. I think really getting to know your best fit customers, like you mentioned, is super, super critical. And I'm surprised how few they say they know the customers and the users, but I've seen only a handful of companies that really, really value talking to customers over and over again to understand, because what we just talked about, activation event can shift, the market can shift, the industry can shift, the product and competitors can shift, and really like getting plugged in and having your people's ears to the ground is super, super important. So that will be my parting advice to folks, is like, start there. If you start there and you don't listen to anything else that we just chatted about, that should lead you to the customers will lead you to the right path.
Ramli, John, everybody, Ramli, thank you so much. I think that's awesome parting advice. Always start with the customer. Understand your customer. The customer, if you're listening, the customer will lead you to the right decisions. So again, Ramli, thank you so much. And make sure everybody check out Ramli's book on activation onboarding, product-led onboarding, and all the best, Ramli. Thanks again for joining us.
If you enjoyed today's conversation about metrics and data, be sure to check out Metric HQ, our online resource for the metrics that matter most to you and your business.